He walked in with her on his arm like she was a trophy he'd finally won. That was the moment Evelyn Marlowe understood that 9 years of silence, sacrifice, and swallowed pride had meant absolutely nothing to Adrian Vanderlyn. He didn't sneak his mistress in through a side door. He didn't look ashamed. He walked Sienna Vale straight into that Sunday lunch, introduced her to his mother with a smile, and then, with everyone watching, he let her take Evelyn's seat at the table. Evelyn's chair, her place, the one she had earned by saving his empire 3 times over. She didn't scream. She didn't throw her wine glass. She reached into her bag, pulled out a thick legal envelope she had prepared that morning, placed her wedding ring on top of it, and slid it across the mahogany table. If she belongs in my place, let her carry what I carried. Then she walked out, and Adrian Vanderlyn, one of the most powerful men in Manhattan, opened the envelope and felt, for the first time in his life, genuine terror. If you've ever sacrificed everything for someone who treated your love like a business asset, this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. Stay with me until the end, because what Evelyn does next changes everything. And if this is your first time here, please subscribe and hit the like button right now. Drop your city and country in the comments to see how far this story travels. Let's begin. The Vanderlyn Sunday lunch had its own gravity. It pulled people in whether they wanted to come or not. For 9 years, Evelyn had arrived at the estate 40 minutes early. Not because anyone asked her to, not because Adrian noticed. She arrived early because she understood something that nobody in that family had ever bothered to learn. Power is maintained in the details. The flowers on the side table needed to be replaced before they wilted past their best. The housekeeper, Rosa, had a bad knee that flared up when the weather changed. And on those days, Evelyn quietly redirected which hallway the service trays came through, so Rosa didn't have to climb the back stairs. The seating arrangement shifted slightly, depending on whether Adrian's Uncle Malcolm had been drinking the night before, because when Malcolm drank, he became loud, and his voice carried into Margot Vanderlyn's perfect dining room, like a foghorn. And Margot would tighten her jaw in a way that meant the next 3 hours would be unbearable for everyone. Evelyn knew all of it, every wrinkle and every ritual. She had dressed that morning in a deep navy dress that Margot once described as appropriate. The word appropriate had always been Margot's highest compliment. Evelyn had learned to accept it the way you accept a participation trophy, with a smile that doesn't reach your eyes. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror for a long time before she finished getting dressed. Not because she was uncertain about what she was wearing. She was uncertain about whether she could walk into that house one more time and sit at that table and perform the role she had been performing for nearly a decade. 2 weeks earlier, she had received a call from her attorney, Mara Ellison. Mara didn't panic easily. She had built her reputation on the specific quality of not panicking. But her voice that afternoon had contained something unfamiliar, a tightness around edges, and she had asked Evelyn to come to her office that evening, rather than waiting until the scheduled meeting the following week. What Mara showed her that night, 3 manila folders laid out on a glass table with the precision of a surgeon presenting x-rays, had taken approximately 40 minutes to fully absorb, and another 3 days to accept. But Evelyn had accepted it. That was what people who didn't know her well always underestimated. She was not a woman who fell apart. She was a woman who absorbed. She picked up her wedding ring from the bathroom counter and looked at it for a moment. Then she set it back down, picked up her phone, called Mara, and said 5 words. "Is the envelope ready?" "On your counter by the door," Mara said. "I had it couriered this morning. Thank you, Evelyn." A pause. "You don't have to do it today." "Yes," she said quietly, "I do." She ended the call, picked up the envelope, slid the wedding ring into her palm, held it there for a second, then placed it carefully in the front pocket of her handbag. She would decide what to do with it when she got there. The estate sat on 11 acres north of the city, and in early autumn, the trees along the drive had just begun to turn. Evelyn had always loved that drive. It was one of the honest things about the Vanderlyn life. The beauty of the land had nothing to do with performance. She parked herself, which surprised Rosa when she came down the front steps to greet her. The family had drivers, Evelyn using one of her own cars was unusual enough that Rosa looked at her sideways. You drove yourself? Felt like it today. Evelyn smiled at her. How's the knee? Terrible. Rain's coming. Use the east hallway for service today. Don't do the stairs. Rosa looked at her with something between gratitude and concern. She had worked for the Vanderlyn family for 11 years, which meant she had watched Evelyn arrive. She had a way of seeing things that she never commented on, the particular silence of someone who had learned that commenting was dangerous. Mrs. Vanderlyn, it's fine, Rosa. Evelyn patted her arm once. Everything is fine, it wasn't, and Rosa probably knew it. But some kindnesses are better received without argument. Inside, the house smelled the way it always did on Sundays, garlic, fresh bread, something braised on the stove since morning. Margot believed that food prepared quickly was food that didn't respect its guests, which meant everything at these lunches had been cooking since approximately 7 in the morning, attended by a kitchen staff of 4 under the supervision of a private chef who had worked for the Vanderlyn family long enough that he remembered Adrian before he had money. Margot herself was in the sitting room off the main hall when Evelyn came through. 71 years old, silver-haired, and dressed with the particular severity of a woman who had once been beautiful and now preferred to be formidable. She looked up from the small stack of papers she had been reviewing and nodded once. You're early, I usually am. Yes, you look tired. I slept fine. Margot studied her for a moment in the way she studied things not warmly, but with precision, the way an appraiser looks at a piece of furniture she's not sure she wants to keep. Adrian called this morning. Oh? He said he was bringing someone. The room didn't move. Evelyn didn't move. She kept her expression exactly where it was and said someone. He didn't give a name. Margot's voice carried the careful neutrality of a woman who knew more than she was saying, and had decided for reasons of her own that now was not the time to say it. I assumed it was a colleague. Evelyn nodded slowly. I'm sure it's fine. She excused herself and went to the dining room to check the flowers. They needed replacing. She was standing at the window when she heard the cars. 2 of them, Adrian's black car and a second one she didn't recognize. She heard the doors. She heard his voice, carrying the way it always carried when he was performing for an audience, big, warm, full of easy confidence. She heard a woman laugh. The laugh was light and unguarded, the laugh of someone who didn't know yet what rooms cost. Evelyn turned from the window. She placed both hands flat on the surface of the sideboard. For just a moment, a private steadying that nobody witnessed, and then she lifted them and straightened her dress and walked toward the hall. She was standing near the doorway to the sitting room when Adrian came through the front entrance with his hand at the small of a woman's back. Sienna Vale was 31. Evelyn would learn her name 20 seconds later when Adrian said it to his mother. She was tall, dark-haired, wearing a dress that was not quite conservative enough for a Sunday family lunch and not quite inappropriate enough to justify objecting to, which told Evelyn she had thought about it. She had large eyes that moved quickly around the room in the way eyes move when they're trying to absorb static signals, who was important, where the center of gravity was. Her eyes landed on Evelyn for half a second and then moved away. Adrian's did not land on Evelyn at all. He walked Sienna straight to Margot. Mother, he said, with the particular warmth he used when he wanted something, this is Sienna. I wanted you to meet her. Margot Vanderlyn shook the woman's hand. Her face did not change. That, Evelyn understood, was the most damning response Margot was capable of giving, not cold, not hostile, simply absent of the warmth she extended when she approved of someone. She shook the hand and said something polite, and then looked across the room. Not at Evelyn. At nothing. Adrian still had not looked at Evelyn. Other family members had begun filtering in from the garden and the sitting rooms. Malcolm came through from the hallway, saw Sienna, and his expression went through 3 changes in under 2 seconds before settling on a kind of forced pleasantness that was worse than open discomfort. Adrian's cousin Thomas stopped in the doorway and then kept moving. His wife Caroline reached for her wine glass with both hands. Everyone was performing. The room had become a stage with no script. And Adrian kept his hand at Sienna's back and guided her toward the dining room, like he was showing her a house he was planning to buy. Evelyn followed. She stood near her usual chair, the one to Adrian's left, the one she had sat in for 9 years, and watched him pull out the chair to his right and help Sienna into it. Then he sat down, in the chair between them, and looked, for the first time since he had walked through the door, directly at Evelyn. He didn't say anything. There was no apology in his face, no guilt. What there was, and she recognized it with a cold certainty that settled into her chest like ice water, was a kind of testing. He was watching to see what she would do, whether she would make a scene, whether she would cry or demand or humiliate herself, whether she would fold. She had spent 9 years not folding. She pulled out the chair across the table, a different chair, an unmarked one, the kind that said, "I am choosing where I sit now," and she sat down. She placed her handbag in her lap, reached inside. Her fingers found the wedding ring first, and then the envelope beneath it. She set the envelope on the table in front of her. She placed the ring on top of it. The conversation around the table stumbled and stopped. Margot's wine glass, halfway to her lips, went still. Malcolm had gone completely rigid. Sienna was looking at the ring on the envelope with the expression of someone who has just realized the room they walked into is not the room they were told it was. Evelyn looked at Adrian across the mahogany table and said the words she had been quietly building toward for the last 14 days. "If she belongs in my place, let her carry what I carried." Then she stood up, picked up her handbag, and walked out of the dining room. She did not run. She did not look back. She walked through the hall, past Rosa, who was standing near the kitchen door, with the expression of a woman who had always known this day would come, and out through the front entrance to her car. She drove 3 miles before she had to pull over. Not because she was crying. She wasn't. She was shaking, the fine, quiet shaking of a body that has held something enormous for too long and been finally permitted to set it down. She sat with both hands on the wheel and breathed until it passed. Then she picked up her phone. "I left it," she said when Mara answered. A brief silence, then, "Where are you?" "Pulled over on Route 9. "Are you safe to drive?" "Yes." "Then come to my office." "I'll be here." Another pause. "Evelyn, you did the right thing." Evelyn didn't answer that. She wasn't sure yet what the right thing looked like. She knew what it had felt like stepping off the edge of something she had been standing on for so long that she'd forgotten the ground beneath it was somebody else's property. She pulled back onto the road. Adrian opened the envelope 40 seconds after she left the room. Malcolm told her this, later told her with the specific guilty detail of a man trying to demonstrate that he was, at least, present for the consequences of his own silence. The table had gone so quiet that they could hear the sound of Adrian's thumbnail running along the sealed edge. He pulled out the first sheet and read it, turned to the second. His face, which had been performing the careful blankness of a man who has decided he will not be embarrassed, began to change in ways he clearly couldn't control. Sienna asked quietly what it was. Adrian didn't answer her. He asked Malcolm to take Sienna to the sitting room. Malcolm did it with a speed that suggested the request was in some ways a relief. Then Adrian sat alone at the head of the table his family had sat at for 40 years, with 9 years of financial guarantees spread out in front of him, and he read every page. What those pages contained, what Evelyn had spent the previous 2 weeks organizing with Mara, what she had pulled from her own financial records with the precision of someone who had always known this day might come, was the complete accounting of what she had silently provided to Vanderlyn Capital across the duration of their marriage. The first emergency had come in year 2. Adrian had overextended through 3 simultaneous acquisitions and a leverage position that his CFO later described in a document Evelyn was not supposed to see as catastrophically optimistic. The banks had been willing to extend, but they needed collateral. Adrian's assets were pledged. There was a gap of approximately $90 million. Evelyn had filled it, quietly, without announcement, without any formal documentation, in Vanderlyn Capital's public filings. She had used assets from the fund she had built before they married a fund that Adrian had always vaguely dismissed as your little investment thing, and she had personally guaranteed the bridge loan that kept. his company breathing for the following 8 months. He thanked her, bought her earrings. The second emergency came in year 4. A regulatory challenge and a hostile position taken by a competing fund had put 2 of Vanderlyn Capital's most significant holdings underwater simultaneously. This time the gap was larger. This time the mechanism more complex. Evelyn spent 6 weeks working with Mara and 2 outside financial consultants to structure a guarantee package that would satisfy 3 different lenders simultaneously without triggering disclosure requirements. She did not tell Adrian what the work cost her. He didn't ask. The third time, year 7, was the most serious. A counterparty default in a leveraged position had created a cascade of margin calls that arrived over 4 days like waves. Evelyn had been in London for a charity board meeting when Adrian called. She flew home that night. By morning, she had restructured her personal guarantee exposure to cover the gap, personally called 2 of the lenders, and sat across from a bank's risk committee and made the case for extending their forbearance with a calm and detail that the committee's chair later told Mara was not what we expected. He did not say what he expected. She did not ask. Each of these events was documented in the envelope. Not in the way a lawyer documents things for litigation cold, technical, bloodless. In the way a person documents things when they finally decide to stop pretending the transactions don't exist. With dates, with amounts, with the names of every institution, every intermediary, every lender who had looked across a table at Evelyn Marlowe and understood, even if they never said it aloud, that the real guarantee in the room was her. At the bottom of the stack was a single letter on Mara's firm's letterhead, dated 2 days earlier. Formal notice that Evelyn Marlowe was suspending her financial support of Vanderlyn Capital in all forms, effective immediately. All outstanding personal guarantees were being flagged for review. Any institution currently relying on those guarantees as collateral was being notified separately. Adrian read it twice. Then he sat very still at the head of the table for approximately 4 minutes, which Malcolm described as feeling like 4 hours. Then he called his CFO. The call was short. His CFO, a man named Dennis, who had worked for Vanderlyn Capital for 6 years, and was one of the people who genuinely did not know, said 3 things in quick succession that Malcolm reported, turned Adrian's face a color he had never seen before. The first thing, 2 of their current credit facilities contained clauses that reference Evelyn's guarantees as supporting collateral. He had always assumed these were procedural, secondary documents. He had not focused on them. The second thing, their largest lender had already received the notification from Mara's office. They had called Dennis 11 minutes before Adrian called him. They were requesting a meeting. The third thing, and the one that seemed to land hardest, there was a quarterly review in 18 days. 3 institutional investors who had been debating whether to increase their exposure to the fund would be receiving their due diligence packages. Packages had been compiled based on the company's financial position. That position had just changed. Adrian ended the call. He looked at Malcolm. Where is she staying? Malcolm shook his head slowly. He didn't know. Find out, Adrian. Find out. Evelyn was staying in an apartment on the Upper West Side that she had leased quietly 6 months earlier under a corporate name that Mara had set up for a different purpose and repurposed without fanfare. She had moved a modest number of personal items there, across 4 separate visits over 3 weeks, bringing nothing that would be noticed as missing from the house they shared in the West Village. No art, no furniture, just clothes, books. The particular ceramic coffee mug she had bought herself in Venice 4 years earlier, and a framed photograph of her mother. She was sitting at the kitchen counter with a cup of tea when her phone showed Adrian's name. She let it ring. Then she called Mara. He's calling. I know. His attorney's office called mine 12 minutes ago requesting an urgent conversation. What did you say? That we were available Thursday. A pause that contained, Evelyn understood, a very specific kind of professional satisfaction. He called back and said that was not acceptable. What did you say to that? Thursday. Evelyn set down her mug. Outside the window, the city moved the way it always moved, without caring who was coming apart inside it. She had always found that comforting. Manhattan's fundamental indifference had been, at various points in her life, both the loneliest and most liberating quality she could imagine. Mara, the freeze, it's complete? Complete. I've notified every institution where your guarantees are active or have been referenced in the last 36 months. They all have the letter. 3 have already responded with acknowledgement and requests for clarification. How long before it actually starts affecting them? The liquidity pressure? Mara considered this. 12 days, maybe less. Some of these facilities have quarterly reset triggers. If his team doesn't get ahead of it, they'll start having conversations they're not prepared for. Another pause. He's going to come to you. I know. Do you know what you want to say? Evelyn thought about this carefully. Not because she hadn't considered it. She had considered almost nothing else for 2 weeks, but because she wanted to say it precisely, even to Mara, even in private. I want him to understand that I know what he did, she said finally. Not what he did today, what he did before today. Mara was quiet for a moment. You're talking about North Star. I'm talking about all of it, Evelyn. Mara's voice was measured, careful. If you're thinking about that conversation, I need you to understand that once we go into that territory, we are in a very different room than a divorce negotiation.
I know. I need to hear you say you know. I know what room we're walking into, Mara.
She looked at the photograph of her mother on the counter across from her. Her mother, who had died 4 years ago, and who had said once, in the particular way, she said the things that mattered most quietly, in the kitchen, while cooking, as though the words deserved no ceremony. The only thing harder than being used is knowing it while it's happening and it's siding still worth it. Her mother had been talking about marriage in general, about the ordinary compromises of loving someone imperfectly. She hadn't known, because Evelyn hadn't told her, that the version she was describing was specifically and precisely her daughter's life. I know what room we're in, Evelyn said again. Let's make sure we're ready when we open the door. She hung up and picked up her tea and sat in her kitchen in the city that didn't care about her or Adrian or the Vanderlyn name, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happy, not relieved, not triumphant. She felt, for the first time in 9 years, like she was sitting in a chair that actually belonged to her. Adrian Vanderlyn arrived at her apartment building at 7:43 in the evening. The doorman called up, which told Evelyn something she had not given Adrian the address, which meant either Malcolm had found it or Adrian had spent money finding it himself. And either way, he had come without being invited and without warning, which was exactly how he had conducted most of their marriage. She told the doorman to let him up. She did not unlock the door until he knocked. When she opened it, she saw immediately that something had happened to him that she had not quite expected. Not the fear she had known the fear was coming, had calculated it precisely. It was something underneath the fear. He looked smaller. Not physically. He was still the same 6'2" that he had always been. Still the same broad shoulders. Still the same jaw that photographed so well in the business magazines that ran features on him twice a year. But there was something gone from inside him, some posture that he maintained so automatically, he probably hadn't known it required maintenance. He looked at her across the threshold and said, "Can I come in?" Not let me in, not we need to talk. Can I come in? Like he was uncertain of the answer. She stepped back. He came inside and stood in her kitchen. Small and simply furnished, nothing like the house they'd shared, and looked around the way people look around unfamiliar spaces when they're trying to collect themselves. How long have you had this place? He asked. 6 months. He absorbed this. You were planning. I was protecting myself. She kept her voice even. There's a difference. He nodded slowly. His hands were in his pockets, which was something he did when he didn't know where to put them, and she had learned to read that gesture as uncertainty, the rare version of Adrian that didn't have a performance ready. The banks are already calling, he said. I know. Dennis says we have a window, but it's short. If the quarterly review... Adrian. She said his name in a way that stopped him. Not sharp, quiet. The way you stop someone from continuing down a path that's only going to make things worse. I'm not here to negotiate the window. He looked at her. I know what North Star Meridian is, she said. The kitchen went very still. Adrian's hands came out of his pockets. I know whose name is on the holding company, she continued. keeping her voice flat, factual, the voice she used in lender meetings. I know when it was formed. I know what moved through it. And she paused, not for effect, but because saying the next part required something from her that she needed to take a breath to find. I know that money from my guarantee package was redirected through it. Adrian said nothing. I need you, she said, to understand that I know that. Before we discuss anything else, I need you to understand that I am not standing here the way I've been standing in that house for 9 years, not knowing what's behind the wall. She looked at him directly. I know what's behind the wall. He was very quiet. Then, in a voice she had almost never heard from him, stripped of performance, stripped of the particular confidence that had always been both his best quality and his most dangerous one, he said, Evelyn, I'm sorry. She looked at him for a long time. I need more than that, she said. I need the truth. And I need it before your attorneys get to decide what version of the truth becomes the official one. He sat down at her kitchen counter, uninvited, in the way that exhausted people sat down not with ownership, but with need. And slowly, in the quiet of the apartment that Adrian had not known existed until 3 hours ago, he began to talk. He talked for a long time. And Evelyn, for once, let him finish before she said a single word. Because she had learned something in 9 years of carrying an empire that was never hers. The person who listens controls the room. And she had decided finally, irrevocably, that the room was hers. He talked for 2 hours and 17 minutes. Evelyn knew the exact duration, because the clock on her kitchen wall was the old-fashioned kind, with an actual second hand, the kind her mother had owned. And she had watched it more than once during the silences that came when Adrian ran out of the version of a story he'd prepared and had to find the real one underneath it. He started with the easy confessions, the ones that cost him least. He admitted that he had known about Sienna for longer than he had pretended, not months, a year and a half. He admitted that he had brought her today not because he had lost his mind, but because he had made a calculation that Evelyn would absorb it the way she absorbed everything else, quietly, invisibly, in a way that cost her and cost him nothing. He admitted he had been wrong about that. Evelyn listened to this part without expression, not because she didn't feel it. She felt it the way you feel a burn, that initial second before the pain fully arrives, but because the marriage was not the room they were in tonight. The marriage was over. She had known it was over, for longer than she had admitted to Mara, longer than she had admitted to herself. What she needed from this conversation existed in an entirely different territory. Tell me about North Star, she said when he paused. He looked at his hands on her kitchen counter. He had large hands. She had always noticed his hands. Had loved them once in the way you love the specific physical qualities of someone before you understand who they are behind them. It started as a holding structure, he said. Victor brought the concept. The idea was to create a separate vehicle for certain investments that had complicated jurisdictional questions. What does that mean? It means the investments involved counterparties in territories where disclosing them in Vanderlyn Capital's primary filings would have created regulatory friction. Adrian, she said his name quietly. I'm not a journalist. You can say what it means. He exhaled slowly. It means we moved money through a structure that wasn't visible to our primary regulators. Clock on the wall ticked. And my guarantee package, she said. The one from year 5. He said nothing. I need you to say it, she said. He lifted his eyes to her. Some of the capital that was freed up through your guarantee, the liquidity it created, was routed into North Star. How much? 47 million. She had known the number. Mara had given it to her. Hearing it from his mouth was a different thing entirely. It landed in her chest with a specific weight, not like grief, not like rage, but like the final confirmation of something she had spent 2 weeks hoping was wrong. Did you know when you asked me to structure the guarantee? She asked. Did you know that's where it was going? The silences lasted 4 seconds. She counted them. Yes, he said. The kitchen was very quiet after that. Evelyn stood up from the stool she had been sitting on, walked to the window, and stood with her back to him for a moment. Outside, the city was doing what it always did. A cab honked somewhere, 12 floors below. A siren moved through the distance. Ordinary sounds from an ordinary night in a city that had no idea what was being said in this apartment. She turned back around. "I want you to understand something," she said. "Not for my lawyer, not for the record, for yourself." She looked at him directly. "You used my name. You used my money, my signature, my reputation, and you did it, knowing that if this structure was ever exposed, my name would be on the documents." "Evelyn, I'm not finished." Her voice didn't rise. It never rose. That was something people consistently underestimated about her, that the absence of volume did not indicate the absence of force. "You decided at some point that I was a resource. Not a partner, a resource, and you structured 9 years of this company around the assumption that I would keep being one." Adrian opened his mouth. "Was there a plan?" she asked. "If regulators found North Star, was there a plan for what my role in it would look like?" He said nothing. "Was there a plan?" she repeated, "where I took responsibility for decisions I never made?" It never got that far, but it was discussed. Another silence. Longer this time. "There were conversations," he said carefully, "about contingency scenarios." "Were those conversations with Victor Dane?" "Yes." "And Caleb Soren?" The name landed differently than the others. She watched his face, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw moved before he answered. "Caleb was involved in structuring North Star." "Yes." "I know what Caleb was involved in," she said. "I'm asking about the contingency conversations." "Caleb was part of those, yes." She nodded slowly. She picked up her tea mug, found it empty, set it back down. Small, ordinary gesture. Something to do with her hands that wasn't what her hands wanted to do. "Then, here is what happens now," she said. "You are going to go back to your attorneys, and you are going to tell them that we are having a conversation. Not negotiation, a conversation. You are going to make sure that no one, not Victor, not Caleb, not anyone in your legal team begins constructing a narrative about my involvement in North Star before I have had a chance to speak to the relevant authorities myself." He stared at her. "Evelyn, because if I find out that a narrative is being built without me," she said, "I will not wait. I will not be managed. I will take everything I have, and I will walk straight into a federal office, and I will hand it to them before you have had your morning coffee." The threat wasn't theatrical. It was simply a fact stated in a flat voice, and that flatness was what made Adrian go completely still. "I need 48 hours, he said. "You have 24. He stood up. He was trying to find something she could see him searching for it, the natural authority he defaulted to, the posture, the certainty. He couldn't quite locate it in this kitchen that wasn't his, in this apartment he hadn't known about, across from a woman who had spent 6 months quietly preparing to exist without him. "Evelyn." He stopped at the kitchen doorway. "I didn't what I did today, at the house." "Sienna. I know that's what started this." "This started before today," she said. "I know." He looked at her with something that might have been genuine. She had known him for 12 years, had loved him for some portion of them, and she still could not always tell, with Adrian, where the genuine ended and the performance began. It was possible he no longer knew either, but I need you to know that today that wasn't about disrespecting you. I don't know what I was trying to do." "I know what you were trying to do," she said simply. "You were trying to make the decision public so that it felt like it had already been made. So I wouldn't fight it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You always understood me better than I understood myself," he said. "Yes," she said. "I did, and I spent 9 years using that understanding to protect you instead of myself." She walked to the door and held it open. He left without another word. She locked the door behind him, stood with her forehead resting against it for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds that she allowed herself. Just 3. And then she straightened up and went to her desk and opened her laptop and began drafting a list of every institution that needed to be contacted before the markets opened in the morning. She worked until 2:45 in the morning. She made no errors. Mara arrived at Evelyn's apartment at 7:15 with coffee, and the expression she wore when things were moving faster than expected, which was not an alarmed expression, but a focused one. The difference between a surgeon who encounters an unexpected complication and one who panics. Mara never panicked, but her focus sharpened in ways that were visible to people who knew her. Victor Dane called his attorney at 6 this morning, she said, setting the cups down and pulling a tablet from her bag. His attorney called ours at 6:42. What did he say? He said his client had information material to the Vanderlyn Capital situation and wanted to explore whether there was a framework for cooperation. Evelyn looked at her. He's scared. Victor is 63 years old and has spent 40 years building a reputation as one of the most respected board members in New York private equity. If North Star becomes public and his name is on the documentation, that reputation is gone in 48 hours. Mara scrolled through something on the tablet. He's not scared, he's calculating. There's a difference. Scared people panic. Calculating people make moves. What kind of move is he making? I think he's deciding whether to cooperate with us or cooperate with Adrian. He's testing the water temperature in both directions before he commits. Evelyn thought about Victor Dane. She had sat across from him at 40 board dinners. He had always been courtly, in the specific way of men who learned manners as social tools rather than genuine expressions, warm enough to seem genuine, reserved enough to stay unreadable. She had never trusted him completely. He was the kind of man who made you feel seen while actually seeing nothing, but his own interests reflected back at him. He'll go with whoever he thinks is going to win, she said. His wife's positioning in the next 24 hours matters more than anything. Mara set the tablet down. I need to talk to you about something. The tone shifted. Evelyn noticed it immediately, not alarm, but gravity. Caleb's Soren, Mara said. Evelyn waited. I had an investigator do a deeper background on him last night. After you told me, Adrian confirmed he was in the contingency conversations. Mara placed a single printed page on the counter between them. Caleb Soren has been in 3 separate corporate structures over the last 15 years that have intersected with federal investigations. None of them resulted in charges against him personally. In each case, the documentation trail was clean, in a way that doesn't feel accidental. Evelyn looked at the page. You're saying he knows how to structure exposure onto other people. I'm saying he's done it before, and nothing has ever touched him. Coffee was good. Evelyn wrapped both hands around the cup and thought about this carefully. There's a wife, she said. Rachel Soren. Married 9 years, 2 children, lives in Westchester. No professional public profile of her own. Mara paused. I mention her because, and this is circumstantial, Caleb Soren filed for a corporate entity's restructuring 2 weeks ago, which is not illegal. But the timing. 2 weeks ago, Evelyn said. Right around when I met with you. Either he had his own information that something was shifting, or someone told him. They looked at each other. Not Adrian, Evelyn said, because she could see Mara thinking it. Adrian wouldn't have told Caleb. If this unravels, Adrian needs Caleb exposed, not protected. Then someone else in Adrian's circle. Victor, Evelyn said. Mara nodded slowly. That's my read. So Victor knew something was moving, warned Caleb, and is now calling us to see which way to jump. Yes. Evelyn set down her coffee. She sat with this for a moment, turning it over, looking at the edges of it. If Caleb starts moving assets or restructuring documentation, she said, and we're not ahead of it. Paper trail gets more complicated, Mara said. Yes. How do we get to him before he finishes moving? Mara was quiet for a moment. There's one path, she said carefully. But I can't recommend it as your attorney. I can only tell you it exists. Tell me, if Rachel Soren knows what her husband keeps in that house, she paused. People in these arrangements, spouses, they either know everything or they know nothing. There's rarely a middle. Another pause. If she knows something, and if she has reason to be afraid of what happens when this collapses, she becomes a mother in Westchester with 2 children and a husband whose professional structure just started moving, Evelyn said quietly. Yes, and she might be looking for someone to talk to before the walls close. That's not something I said, Mara told her. No, Evelyn agreed. It's something I thought of on my own. The call from Malcolm Vanderlyn came at 11 that morning, and Evelyn almost didn't answer it. She had no particular anger at Malcolm, not yet, but she knew that whatever he wanted to say was going to be on behalf of the family rather than on behalf of himself, and she had run out of patience for the Vanderlyn family's collective interests approximately 24 hours ago. She answered anyway. Evelyn. His voice was older over the phone than in person, which surprised her. She had always thought of Malcolm as vigorous, the athletic uncle who skied in Januaries and sailed in August and treated his body with the seriousness of a man who knew it was one of his more reliable assets. Over the phone at 11 in the morning, he sounded tired. I owe you an apology. She waited. Not a small one, he said. A real one. Then give me a real one. I knew about North Star, he said. Not the details. Not all of it. But I knew there was a structure. And I knew Evelyn, I knew it involved money that had moved through your guarantee packages. I found out 2 years ago. The apartment was very quiet. You found out 2 years ago, she said, yes. And you said nothing. His voice caught. Not dramatically, not in the way of some performing regret, but in the small, cracked way of a man who has been holding something heavy for a long time and has finally put it down in front of someone. I convinced myself that it wasn't, that Adrian was reckless, not criminal, that there was a difference between aggressive financial structuring and something that would actually hurt you. Did you believe that? A long pause. No, not entirely. Then what was it? It was the name, he said. It was the company. He stopped. I was a coward, Evelyn. I'm not going to dress it up. She thought about Malcolm at those Sunday lunches. His easy laugh. The way he had always been slightly warmer to her than the rest of the family, which she had taken as genuine affection. Probably some of it was genuine. That was the thing about betrayals. From people you liked, they were never clean. I need to know one thing, she said. Did you tell anyone that you knew? Victor? Caleb? No. Quickly. Definitively, no one. She believed him. Not because she trusted him completely. She didn't. Not anymore, but because Malcolm's particular failure was the failure of silence, not the failure of action. He had done nothing when he should have acted. That was different from conspiring. Are you telling me now because you've decided to do the right thing? She asked. Or because you think this is about to surface and you want to be on the right side of it? Another long pause, longer than the last one. Both, he said finally. I'm not going to pretend it's only one. Something about that answer was the most honest thing anyone in the Vanderlyn family had said to her in years. I'll be in touch, she said. Don't talk to anyone. Not Adrian, not Victor, not his attorney. If anyone from the family calls, say you're consulting your own lawyer. Okay, Malcolm. She stopped him before he could hang up. Get your own lawyer. A good one. Someone who doesn't have existing relationships with Vanderlyn Capital. He understood what that meant. Yes, he said quietly. I will. Rachel Soren called at 4:17 in the afternoon. Not the other way around. Evelyn was at Mara's office when her personal cell phone showed a number she didn't recognize with a Westchester area code. She looked at Mara across the conference table. Mara raised her eyebrows once, which was her version of well. Evelyn answered. Is this Evelyn Marlowe? The voice was controlled, but only barely the control of someone who has been rehearsing a phone call for hours and is now discovering that the actual moment of making it is different from the rehearsal. Yes, my name is Rachel Soren, a breath. My husband is Caleb Soren. I know who you are, Evelyn said, keeping her voice neutral. Then you might know that my husband came home last night and spent 4 hours on the phone and then told me we needed to take a trip for a few weeks. He wants to go Thursday. Another breath, shallower this time. I have 2 kids in school. I'm not taking them out of school to go on a trip that my husband can't tell me the reason for. Evelyn looked at Mara. Mara had gone very still, Mrs. Soren said carefully, I don't know what I can. There's a filing cabinet in Caleb's home office, Rachel said. The words came faster now, the way words come when someone has decided to jump and has thinking about the height. He keeps the key in his desk drawer. I know because I've seen him use it. I've never opened it. I never wanted to know. A pause that had something breaking inside it. I want to know now. Evelyn breathed steadily. Why are you calling me? Because you left, Rachel said. I saw it. It was on 3 different news sites this morning. They don't know what happened, but they know you left that lunch, and they know something is wrong. And I thought her voice caught. I thought that if you were willing to walk out of that room, you were the person I should call. Evelyn pressed 2 fingers to her temple briefly. She looked at Mara. Mara had already picked up her pen and was writing on the yellow pad in front of her, attorney present. Document everything. Do not make promises. Mrs. Soren, Evelyn said, before this conversation goes any further, I need you to understand that I have an attorney and that anything we discuss could have legal implications for both of us. I understand that. My attorney is present right now. Okay. A pause. Does she have a pen? Mara's mouth did something that was almost a smile. She has a pen, Evelyn said. Good. Rachel Soren took one long audible breath. Then let me tell you what I think is in that cabinet. She didn't know everything. That was the first and most important thing Evelyn calibrated as Rachel talked. She was a woman who had absorbed information the way water absorbs through the edges of a sealed container, slowly, through proximity and time, not through any direct disclosure. She knew things because she had been present, because she had overheard, because she had seen documents left open on a desk on 2 separate occasions and made the choice each time to close her eyes. She was done closing her eyes. What she described added up to this. Caleb Soren kept handwritten records. Not digital handwritten, in ledger books, the kind you bought at business supply stores before everything went electronic. And the reason Caleb kept handwritten records was a reason Rachel didn't have to explain to Evelyn, because Evelyn had figured it out the moment she heard it. Handwritten records didn't exist in servers. They couldn't be accessed remotely. They couldn't be subpoenaed from a cloud. They existed in one place, and that place was a filing cabinet in a house in Westchester. How many books? Mara asked. She had taken the call off speaker and was now sitting close enough that both women could hear. I think 4, Rachel said. Maybe 5. He added a new one I saw the cover maybe 8 months ago. And you believe they document transactions related to North Star Meridian Holdings? Pause. I believe they document everything Caleb has ever done, that he didn't want to exist anywhere else, Rachel said. Which, based on what I've been putting together in my head for the last 12 hours, is a great deal. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Soren, Rachel, I need to ask you something directly. Yes. Is your husband in the house right now? No, he's in the city. He won't be back until late. A pause. Possibly not until tomorrow. And you want to open the cabinet. I already opened it, Rachel said. 20 minutes ago, Fat. That's why I called. The room shifted. Evelyn felt it, the specific sensation of a situation moving from potential to actual, from a thing that might happen to a thing that was happening right now, in a house in Westchester, with a woman sitting next to a filing cabinet full of handwritten evidence. Is there someone who can be with you? Mara asked, her voice absolutely level. Legally, you should not be alone in handling those documents. They become part of any legal proceeding. What do I do? Rachel asked. The control was slipping slightly now, just at the edges. I've got 4 ledgers in front of me, and I don't know if I should touch them or photograph them or... Don't move them, Mara said. Don't reorder them. Don't remove anything from the cabinet. Can you photograph every page in place without rearranging anything? Yes. Do that, starting now. Every page, in the order it appears, in the book in which it appears. Mara was already on her second line, gesturing toward her assistant through the glass wall of the office. I'm going to have someone there within 90 minutes. Don't open the door for anyone else. If Caleb calls, answer normally, give him nothing. Okay. Rachel's voice had gone quieter, more grounded. The way people go when they're finally doing something instead of waiting to do it. Okay, I can do that, Rachel, Evelyn said. Yes. You're doing the right thing, a silence. Then I know. I'm terrified, but I know. The call ended. Mara was already on the phone to her investigator. Evelyn sat very still at the conference table and thought about the shape of what was happening, the way 4 separate threads had begun pulling in the same direction in the last 18 hours, without anyone orchestrating it. Just the natural gravity of a structure that had been held in place by silence, and silence was finally ending. She thought about Caleb Soren coming home tomorrow and opening that cabinet. She thought about how many days they had before the shape of this changed from something they controlled to something that controlled them. Then Mara ended her call and sat back down across from her and said, "The investigator will be in Westchester in 70 minutes. If the ledgers are what Rachel thinks they are, Evelyn said. Then we have something that changes the architecture of everything." Mara looked at her carefully. and we need to decide, before we have it in our hands, what we do with it. Evelyn knew what she meant. She had been thinking about it since the moment Rachel said she had opened the cabinet. The ledgers, if they documented what everyone in this room believed they documented, were not a negotiating tool. They were not leverage to be held quietly while attorneys arranged a settlement. They were federal evidence, the kind that came with obligations and consequences, and a door that, once open, could not be closed again. "How long do we have to make that decision?" she asked. "If Caleb is in the city tonight and back tomorrow," Mara did the calculation. 18 hours. Maybe 20. Evelyn looked at the yellow legal pad in front of her, at the notes Mara had been making since Rachel's call, at the shape of everything that had moved in the last 36 hours. Adrian's confession in her kitchen, Malcolm's call, Victor's attorney reaching out, and now Rachel Soren, sitting in Westchester with 4 ledgers that a man who specialized in making evidence disappear had apparently never imagined anyone would open. "There's one more thing," Mara said. She picked up the tablet again and turned it toward Evelyn. "My investigator found this 20 minutes ago. It was filed this morning with the State Corporate Commission." Evelyn looked at the screen. North Star Meridian Holdings. An amendment to their registered agent information. Filed at 9:47 in the morning, 47 minutes after Mara had sent the notification letters to the banks. Someone was already moving. Not slowly, not carefully. Urgently. "Victor?" Evelyn said. "The attorney who filed is on Victor Dane's payroll," Mara said. "Which means Victor already has someone restructuring the North Star documentation, and the timeline he gave us this morning about wanting to cooperate was not honest. He was buying time." Evelyn set down the tablet. She looked at the window. Outside, the city was beginning its early descent. Toward evening, the light going amber over the buildings. The traffic thickening on the streets below. The 1,000 ordinary simultaneous lives of Manhattan proceeding without any awareness of the thing being decided in this conference room. "How long," she said quietly, "before the restructuring is complete enough to change what the documentation shows? With competent counsel and the specific amendments they're filing?" Mara's voice was flat. 48 to 72 hours. After that, the paper trail in North Star looks significantly different. Evelyn understood then clearly, completely, without any remaining ambiguity, that the decision she had been thinking of, as something she still had time to make, had already made itself. There was no 18 hours. There was no 20. There was now, tonight, before Victor's attorneys restructured enough of North Star to bury what Rachel's ledgers could prove. She looked at Mara. Mara looked back at her. "I need a federal contact," Evelyn said. Mara had been expecting this. She had probably been expecting it since the morning. She opened the tablet again without drama, without ceremony, and pulled up a name and a direct phone number and pushed it across the table. "She's good," Mara said. "She's thorough, and she will not give you any comfortable middle ground." "I'm not looking for comfortable middle ground. I know." Mara held her gaze for a moment. "Evelyn, once you make this call, once this moves from our office into that space, Adrian doesn't control the narrative anymore. Victor doesn't. Caleb doesn't." A pause. "You don't either." Evelyn picked up the tablet. She looked at the name on the screen for a long moment. "I know," she said. She picked up her phone. She's dialed. It rang twice before a woman answered with a last name and a title, and the alert cadence of someone accustomed to receiving calls that arrived because something had already gone too far. Evelyn took one breath. "My name is Evelyn Marlowe," she said. "I have evidence of a federal financial violation. I have corroborating documentation, and I have reason to believe the paper trail is being restructured as we speak. I need to meet tonight." A brief pause on the other end. "Then how long will you need?" Evelyn looked at Mara. Mara held up 3 fingers. 3 hours, Evelyn said. "I'll bring everything. I'll clear my evening," the woman said. "Send me a location." The call ended. Evelyn set the phone down on the conference table. She thought of Adrian in her kitchen the night before, exhausted and stripped of his usual performance, saying, "I didn't understand how much you had done." Thought of 9 years of Sunday lunches and swallowed words and financial structures built on her silence. She thought of her name on documents she had never meant to sign in the way they had been used. Then she stopped thinking about the past, because the past was finished, and what existed now was only forward. She picked up her phone again and called Rachel Soren. "Keep photographing," she said when Rachel answered. "Someone is on the way. And Rachel, when this is over, you are going to be okay." A silence. Then Rachel said something that Evelyn did not expect, something that landed quietly and stayed. "I know. I knew the minute I opened that cabinet. I just needed someone else to know it too." Evelyn ended the call. She looked at Mara once more, and Mara looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there was nothing useful left to say. The decision was made. The door was open, and on the other side of it was everything that could not be taken back. The federal building on Worth Street had a specific quality of silence after 7 in the evening, not empty silence, but compressed silence. The kind that accumulates in places where consequential things happen during the day and the weight of them stays in the air after everyone goes home. Evelyn noticed it the moment she and Mara stepped off the elevator on the 14th floor. The carpet was the particular shade of gray that federal buildings used everywhere, as though someone in Washington had decided decades ago that gray was the color of seriousness and had never revisited the decision. The lighting was fluorescent and unforgiving. A water cooler hummed near the reception desk, where a young woman in a dark blazer had been waiting for them and led them down a hallway without small talk. The woman they were meeting was named Claire Ashworth. Late 40s, dark hair cut short, wearing a suit that had been excellent once and was now the suit of someone who had stopped caring whether her suit was excellent because she had better things to care about. She was standing when they came through the door of the conference room, and she shook Evelyn's hand first, then Mara's, and she did not smile, but she was not unfriendly. She was simply focused, in the manner of a person for whom focus was the natural resting state. "Ms. Marlowe," she said, "thank you for coming tonight." "Thank you for clearing your evening," Evelyn said. "Sit down." Claire gestured to the chairs across from her. "I've reviewed the summary your attorney sent over. I want to hear it from you directly, from the beginning." So Evelyn told her, not the emotional version, not the story of a marriage and a betrayal and a woman who spent 9 years being quietly useful to a man who treated her usefulness as a natural resource. That version was true, but it was not what Claire Ashworth needed. And Evelyn was precise enough about what situations required to know the difference. What she gave her instead was the financial version, the one that existed in documents and dates and dollar amounts, the one that began with the first guarantee package in year 2 and moved through each subsequent intervention with the specific detail of someone who had kept meticulous records because she'd always, on some level, understood that the records might matter. Claire listened without interrupting. She had a legal pad in front of her, and she wrote on it occasionally, but not constantly, which told Evelyn she was absorbing rather than transcribing, which told Evelyn she was smart. When Evelyn finished, Claire looked at the pad for a moment. Then she looked up. "The ledgers," she said. "Where are they now?" Mara answered, "Our forensic specialist is with Mrs. Soren in Westchester, as of 90 minutes ago. The books have been photographed in situ. We have not removed them from the property." "Good." Claire made a note. "We're going to need a warrant for those. Which means I'm going to need to move quickly because if Soren comes back and those books disappear." "Victor Dane's attorneys filed a corporate amendment to North Star Meridian this morning," Mara said. She pushed a printed copy across the table. "They're restructuring the documentation." Claire looked at the filing. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture did a slight forward shift, the physical tell of someone whose timeline just compressed. "How long have you known about North Star?" she asked Evelyn. 14 days, Evelyn said. "From the moment I knew, I did not take any action to conceal it, or to give anyone time to restructure it. The timeline is documented." Claire looked at her steadily. "I'm going to ask you something directly, and I need a direct answer." "Yes. Is there any version of this where your involvement with these financial structures goes beyond what you've described tonight? Any decision you made, any document you signed, any conversation you had where you understood that funds were being moved outside the disclosed structure?" The question landed the way these questions always landed, not like an accusation, but like a scalpel, testing whether the thing underneath was solid or hollow. No, Evelyn said. My involvement was as a guarantor. I provided financial backing that I was told was being used to stabilize Vanderlyn Capital's disclosed positions. I was not informed that any portion of the capital freed by my guarantees was being redirected. Adrian Vanderlyn told you this personally? Last night. In my apartment. I can provide the timeline and, if necessary, have my account of the conversation corroborated. Claire wrote something. I'm going to need you to come back tomorrow morning with your complete financial records going back 10 years. Everything related to the guarantees. Everything. She looked at Mara. And I'm going to need your firm to sit on those Westchester ledgers until I have the warrant, which I am filing tonight. Understood, Mara said. Claire sat back. She looked at Evelyn with the particular quality of attention that was not sympathy but was not its absence either. Ms. Marlowe, I want you to understand what you've started tonight. I understand it. I'm not sure you do. When we open this, when we follow the money out of North Star, we don't know where it leads. Connections your documents suggest, the public officials, the development deals, this could go in directions that none of us in this room can fully anticipate. I know that, and you're prepared for that. Evelyn looked at her. What I'm not prepared for, she said, is having my name on documents that make me look like I was part of something I had no knowledge of. That is the specific thing I am not prepared for. Something shifted in Claire Ashworth's eyes. Not softening, she was not a woman who softened easily, but a recognition. The recognition of someone who has been told the truth and knows it. All right, Claire said, let's get to work. They left the federal building at 10:47. The night had turned cold in the way Manhattan nights turned cold in autumn, suddenly without negotiation, as though the temperature had been waiting for the sun to be fully gone before it made its move. Mara's driver was waiting. They got in without speaking, and the car moved into the flow of midtown traffic. And for 3 blocks, neither of them said anything, because sometimes after you do a thing that can't be undone, the first requirement is simply to breathe. Then Mara said it went as well as it could have. Yes, Ashworth is good. She'll move fast on the warrant. I know. Another block of silence. Then Mara said, more carefully, Evelyn. I want you to think about tonight. Sleeping, actually sleeping. Tomorrow is going to be long, and it's going to require you at full capacity. I know. I'm not asking if you know. I'm asking if you'll do it. Evelyn almost smiled. I'll do what I can. Mara looked at her for a moment with the expression she rarely used, not the attorney expression, but the other one. The expression of someone who had known Evelyn for 11 years and had watched her carry things that would have broken people with better support systems and more witnesses to their carrying. You did the right thing tonight, Mara said. You said that yesterday. I'll keep saying it until it stops being necessary. The car stopped at Evelyn's building. She got out and stood on the sidewalk for a moment after the car pulled away, looking at nothing in particular, just the street. The ordinary Manhattan street, with its ordinary nighttime rhythm, and felt the specific heaviness of a person who has made an irreversible decision and now has to live inside the consequences of it without yet knowing their full shape. She went upstairs. She did not sleep for 4 hours. But she did sleep. The call came at 6:11 in the morning, and it was not from Mara. It was from a number she didn't recognize, and she almost didn't answer it. And the fact that she did answer it, the small, unexamined instinct that made her thumb move across the screen, would turn out to be the hinge on which the next 72 hours turned. Ms. Marlowe, a man's voice, measured, careful in the way that voices are careful when their owner has rehearsed what they're about to say, but is discovering that the rehearsal didn't fully prepare them for the actual moment. My name is Caleb Soren. She sat up in the dark of her bedroom. Her heart rate did not spike. It steadied, actually, the way her heart always steadied when something she had anticipated arrived. The anticipation was over. This was the thing itself. Mr. Soren, she said, I know you were in a federal building last night, he said. I know who you met with. The steadiness held. Then you know I'm not in a position to discuss it with you. I'm not asking you to discuss it, a pause. I'm asking you to listen. She said nothing, which was, she understood, its own kind of answer. There are things in those ledgers, he said, that you do not want surfaced in a federal investigation. Things that connect to your guarantee packages in ways that are more complicated than your attorney has told you. The Stenisons cracked. Just slightly. Just enough that she was aware of it. What does that mean? She asked. It means that the documentation trail in those books doesn't look the way you think it looks. His voice had gone quiet, almost conversational, with the specific confidence of a man who has been in rooms like this before and knows where the exits are. It means that there are entries in those ledgers that will require a great deal of explanation from you personally. Entries that document a pattern of communication between yourself and North Star's principals. That's not possible, she said. The words came out before she fully processed them, automatic and immediate, the words of someone who knows their own history. I understand that's your position, Caleb said. That's not a position. That's a fact. I had no communication with anyone at North Star Meridian. My involvement was limited to the guarantee packages. Ms. Marlowe, he paused. I kept very detailed records. The sentence sat in the air of her dark bedroom, and she looked at it, really looked at it, and felt the first genuine cold thread of something that was not quite fear, but was its near neighbor, move through her chest. What are you saying? She asked. I'm saying that before those ledgers are in federal hands, he said, you might want to have your attorney review what's actually in them. He ended the call. Evelyn sat in the dark for 11 seconds. She counted them, the way she had counted the seconds of Adrian's silence the night before. Because counting was something to do with her mind, when her mind was trying to process something it didn't want to accept, Sininun. Then she called Mara. Mara answered on the second ring, which meant she had been awake. I was about to call you, Mara said. Something's happened. Caleb Soren just called me. A pause. What? 6 minutes ago. He said there are entries in the ledgers that document communication between me and North Star's principals. The silence that followed was the most frightening silence Mara had produced in 11 years of their relationship, because Mara did not go silent when things were manageable. She went silent when she was recalibrating. That's not possible, Mara said. That's what I told him. You have no communication with anyone at North Star. I've reviewed everything. I know. Then he's bluffing. He's trying to rattle you before Ashworth gets the warrant. Or Evelyn said, and she forced herself to say it, forced herself to look directly at the possibility instead of away from it. The ledgers don't only contain what Rachel believes they contain. Another silence, shorter this time. I'm sending someone to Westchester right now, Mara said. I need eyes on every page before the warrant is executed. Mara. Evelyn kept her voice very even. If there is something in those books that connects my name to North Star, even fabricated, even manufactured, and it goes into federal evidence before we've seen it. I know, Mara said. I know, give me 40 minutes. It took 53 minutes, and every one of them was its own small version of the thing Evelyn had been managing for 9 years, the thing that lived beneath the composure, beneath the precision, beneath the ability to sit in rooms and speak in the flat financial language that made bankers listen. The thing that was simply the weight of caring about an outcome you could not fully control. She was dressed and at her kitchen counter with coffee. She wasn't drinking when Mara called back. Tell me, Evelyn said. Our specialist has been through both ledgers that Rachel had access to. Mara's voice had the careful quality of someone reading from a tightrope. The financial documentation is exactly what we anticipated. Detailed records of North Star transactions, the redirect of capital from your guarantee packages, payment records that connect to the development deals and the officials. It's significant. It's everything we hoped. But Evelyn said, there's a third ledger. A pause. Rachel didn't know about it. It was in a locked interior drawer inside the cabinet, separate from the others. Our specialist found it when he did a full inventory. Evelyn set down the coffee cup. What's in it? We haven't photographed it yet. Rachel opened it and read us some of it over the phone. Mara, there are entries that reference your name. The same notation used in the documents Adrian authored. Dates, phone numbers, a description of meetings. Mara stopped. Evelyn, some of these dates correspond to times when you were in contact with Adrian about the guarantee packages. But the way they're notated, the context Caleb has written around them, suggests the meetings were with him. with Caleb. That you were a knowing participant in discussions about North Star. The room did not spin. Evelyn did not feel dizzy or nauseated, or any of the sexual symptoms that people described when they encountered something devastating. What she felt was a complete and crystalline stillness, the kind that comes when something your body understood before your mind caught up is finally confirmed. He created a parallel record, she said. It looks that way, yes. He documented real events, my calls with Adrian, my meetings about the guarantees, and reframed them. Made them look like contact with North Star's principals instead of contact with my own husband about my own financial exposure. That's what it looks like. She stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there for a moment at the city without seeing it. How long has he been building it, she asked. Based on the dates in the entries, at least 3 years. 3 years. He had been building a false parallel record for 3 years. Which meant this was not a panicked response to the situation unfolding now. This was a structure that had been designed, deliberately and patiently, as a contingency. A human shield made of fabricated documentation built around someone else's name. Her name. He said it last night, she said. Not to Mara, mostly to herself. He said the ledgers don't look the way I think they look. He wasn't bluffing. No, Mara said. He wasn't. He's been planning this since before I knew North Star existed. Yes. She turned from the window. Something was happening inside her that she couldn't fully name, not fear, not rage, though both were present. It was something older and more fundamental than either of those, the sensation of having stood in a room and believed you understood its dimensions, and then discovered that there was a room behind the room, and behind that room another room, and the structure you thought you were standing in was not the structure that existed. Can we prove it's fabricated? She asked. That's the question, Mara said. Some of it we can prove. The meetings he's documented on 3 of those dates. I have calendar records that show where you actually were, and it wasn't anywhere near Caleb Soren. But others are dates when I was meeting with Adrian, where I was, effectively, in North Star-related conversations without knowing they were North Star-related. Yes, she pressed 2 fingers to her temple, hard, harder than she needed to. If those ledgers go into federal evidence as they are, she said, what does it look like? Mara was quiet for a moment. It looks complicated, she said. It doesn't look like proof of guilt, but it looks like questions. And questions in federal investigations have a way of taking a great deal of time and a great deal of money to answer, which is exactly what he designed it to do. Yes. He designed it to be not quite provable, not quite disprovable, just complicated enough that when everything collapsed, I would be too busy defending myself to be an effective witness against anyone else. Evelyn. Mara's voice had shifted from the attorney voice to the other one, the one underneath. I need to ask you something. Ask. Did Adrian know about the 3rd ledger? The question moved through her slowly. Because it was the right question, she recognized it immediately as the right question, and because the answer to it, whatever it was going to fundamentally restructure her understanding of the last 48 hours. Of Adrian's confession in her kitchen, of his apparent honesty, of the exhausted, stripped of performance version of him that had sat at her counter and said her name in a voice she hadn't heard before. She thought about that version of him. She thought about the 4 seconds of silence before he admitted that yes, he had known where the guarantee funds were going. She thought about his face when she mentioned North Star, the tightening around his eyes. She thought about something else, something she hadn't thought about until this moment. He had not mentioned Caleb's ledgers. In 2 hours and 17 minutes of confessing, with a specificity that had felt complete, he had not once mentioned that Caleb Soren kept handwritten records. A man who had worked with Caleb Soren for 5 years would know that Caleb Soren kept handwritten records. I don't know, she said, and that is the most frightening answer I can give you. Then we need to find out before we proceed any further. I know. Evelyn, Mara stopped. When she continued, her voice was precise and deliberate. If Adrian knew about the 3rd ledger, if he knew what was in it, then his confession to you last night was not a confession. It was a navigation. He told you the things that were going to surface anyway, and positioned himself on the right side of them. And he left out the one thing that would change everything. Evelyn stared at the wall of her kitchen. The ceramic mug from Venice sat on the counter. The photograph of her mother. The two ordinary objects she had moved here from a life she was leaving. The two things she had chosen when she decided what to keep. She looked at her mother's face in the photograph. Her mother at 53, standing in the garden of the house in Connecticut, where Evelyn had grown up, squinting slightly in the afternoon light, not posing, just caught mid-motion. The way most of the photographs of her mother were mid-motion, mid-thought, alive. She thought about what her mother had said. The thing in the kitchen. The only thing harder than being used is knowing it while it's happening and deciding it's still worth it. She had spent 9 years deciding it was worth it. She had been wrong, but she had decided. What she had not decided, what no one had given her the opportunity to decide, was whether to be the person whose name went on the contingency plan. She had not been asked. She had not been consulted. She had simply been selected, the way you select a tool for a specific purpose, and the selection had been made 3 years ago, quietly, in handwriting, in a locked drawer, by a man who specialized in never being the one whose name ended up on the wrong line. Set up a meeting with Adrian, she said. Her voice was steady. Absolutely steady today, not through attorneys, just him and me. Evelyn, I don't recommend. I know you don't. Set it up anyway. Pause. What are you going to do? I'm going to look at him, she said, and I'm going to ask him one question. And I'm going to know from the answer whether what happened in my kitchen 2 nights ago was real, or whether I've been managed since the moment I walked out of that lunch. Mara was quiet, and then Evelyn said, depending on what I learn, I'm going to decide what kind of person I need to become to survive this. Adrian agreed to meet without conditions, which told her something. If he were managing her, he would have sent arts attorneys first. If he were guilty of knowing about the third ledger, he would have needed time to prepare. Instead, he agreed immediately, the way someone agrees when they've been waiting for the call. They met in a small conference room, in a private members club off Park Avenue that belonged to neither of them. Mara had arranged it. Neutral ground, no staff in the room, no recording for either side. Adrian was already there when Evelyn arrived. He looked worse than he had 2 nights ago. His shirt was the right shirt, but it had been put on with insufficient attention, the collar slightly asymmetrical, the cuffs not quite positioned. He had the look of a man who had slept badly and eaten nothing, and was running on a kind of adrenaline that had long since stopped being productive and was now simply corrosive. He stood when she came in. Old manners. She didn't tell him to sit. She sat down across from him and put her hands flat on the table and looked at him. Did you know about Caleb's third ledger? She asked. No preamble. No construction of context. The question, bare and direct, the way a scalpel is direct. Adrian looked at her. 4 seconds. Then, what third ledger? She studied his face. She had been studying his face for 12 years. She knew it the way you know a landscape you have returned to, across many seasons, all its weather, all its changes, the specific way it moved when something was being hidden. Confusion was real. She was almost certain the confusion was real. And somehow that was the most disorienting thing that had happened in 72 hours. Caleb kept a third ledger, she said, in a locked interior drawer, separate from the others. It contains entries that frame my contact with you about the guarantee packages as knowing participation in North Star's operations. Adrian went very still. It's been building for 3 years, she said. He documented real events, real dates, real phone calls, and reframed them. Made them look like my meetings with him rather than my meetings with you. Adrian's face moved through something she couldn't immediately name. Then he said, in a voice that was quiet and rough at the edges, Caleb told me once, early on, that he had a system for managing risk. What does that mean? I didn't ask. He looked at the table. I didn't ask because I didn't want to know. The anger arrived then. Not the controlled version she had been operating with for the past 3 days. Something older and less managed. Something that had been waiting beneath the composure. You didn't ask, she said. No. He was building a case against me for 3 years. He was building a structure that would make it look like I was complicit in something I had no knowledge of. And you knew he had a risk management system, and you did not ask what it was. I didn't know it was, you didn't ask, she said again. Each word separate, each word its own complete sentence. Because not knowing gave you room. It gave you the ability to sit in my kitchen 2 nights ago and confess the things you were going to have to confess eventually and feel like you were being honest. Because you technically were. You told me the things you knew. You left out the things you had specifically arranged not to know. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the 12 years between them sat in the space between their chairs like a physical object. I didn't intend for it to be you, he said. I know. And she did know, which was the terrible part. He hadn't sat down and selected her. He had simply not asked, and not asking had allowed the selection to happen around him, and that was its own particular kind of corruption, not the sharp, deliberate kind, but the slow, ambient kind. The kind that lives in the decision to never look too closely at what your survival is, costing the people nearest you. What are you going to do? He asked. She looked at him for a moment longer. I'm going to do what I should have done before I ever walked into that federal office, she said. I'm going to find out exactly what was in those ledgers. Every entry, every date, every notation with my name on it. And I'm going to build a response that is airtight before anyone else gets to define what they mean. Evelyn, I need something from you, she said. He waited. I need you to call Caleb Soren, she said. I need you to call him tonight, and I need you to get him to tell you what exactly he put in that third ledger. All of it. You tell him the investigation is moving faster than expected. You tell him you need to coordinate your exposure. You tell him whatever you have to tell him. She looked at him without warmth, without the residue of the feeling that had once lived in this space between them. And you record every word. Adrian held her gaze. If I do that, if you do that, she said, I will make sure that the federal investigators understand the full context of your involvement in North Star. That you were reckless and self-serving and willfully ignorant. Not that you designed a plan to destroy your wife. There's a difference. Yes, she said, there is. And it's the difference between the life you'll have on the other side of this and the one you won't have. She stood up. This is the only offer you'll get from me. I need an answer tonight. She picked up her bag. Adrian sat at the table with his hands in front of him and looked at nothing for a moment. Then he said, okay. She walked toward the door. Evelyn. His voice stopped her just before she reached it. She didn't turn around. I'm sorry. Not for being caught. For being the kind of person it was possible to catch. She stood with her back to him for 2 seconds, 3. Then she walked out. The hallway outside was empty and quiet, and she stood in it for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the wall, not for support, just for contact, the specific physical need for something solid that didn't move. The wall was solid. She breathed. Then she took her hand off the wall, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the elevator, because there was no version of the next 12 hours that allowed for anything that was not forward motion. She had understood since the moment she read Caleb's name in those documents that the person she had been, the person who absorbed, who carried, who stayed quiet and capable and contained, was not the person this moment required. The elevator opened. She got in, and in the polished metal of the elevator doors, she caught her own reflection for a fraction of a second, just a glimpse, blurred and imprecise. And what she saw was not a woman who had been broken. What she saw was a woman who had finally stopped pretending that the weight she'd been carrying had anything to do with love, and was putting it down. Adrian made the call at 9:47 that night. Evelyn knew the exact time, because she was sitting in Mara's conference room when it happened, listening through a single earpiece connected to the recording app on a burner phone that Mara's investigator had couriered to Adrian's hotel 2 hours earlier, with instructions so specific they had been written out in a numbered list, and then the list had been destroyed. The room was dark except for the lamp on the credenza in the corner, which threw a narrow column of yellow light across the table and left everything else in shadow. Mara sat across from Evelyn. Between them was a legal pad, a glass of water that neither of them had touched, and a small speaker that carried the sound of a phone ringing in a room they couldn't see. Caleb Soren answered on the third ring. Adrian. His voice was careful. Not surprised careful. Which meant he had been expecting this call, had probably been expecting it since Rachel's phone call to Evelyn, had possibly been expecting it since the morning the banks received Mara's notifications. Caleb Soren Evelyn had come to understand was a man who expected most things. He had built his professional life around the practice of being less surprised than the people around him. "We need to talk," Adrian said. His voice was controlled, but it carried a particular strain underneath it, the strain of a man performing composure on top of something that was not composed. Evelyn had asked him to sound natural, and he was doing his best, which was not entirely convincing if you knew him. But Caleb Soren didn't know him the way she did. "I've been waiting for you to call," Caleb said. "The investigation is moving faster than I expected." Adrian paused. "Ashworth's office. They have the ledgers." A brief silence. "Which ledgers?" Not a question. The way Caleb said it flat, precise, it was not a question. He was not asking which ledgers. He was establishing which ledgers Adrian knew about. "The two from the cabinet," Adrian said. "Rachel gave them access." Another silence. This one longer. Evelyn watched Mara's hand move across the legal pad without looking down, keeping her eyes on the speaker. "Rachel," Caleb said, and in the single word her name, said that way was the particular sound of a man who had miscalculated in a specific direction. "I need to know," Adrian said, and here his voice shifted, lost some of the performance and found something raw underneath it. "What exactly is in the third one?" The silence that followed was 4 seconds long. Evelyn counted them. Then Caleb said, "Where did you hear about a third ledger?" "Does it matter?" "Yes." Adrian's voice hardened. "I have been in a federal conference room. I have had conversations I cannot walk back. And I am sitting in a hotel room right now understanding that the thing you told me was a risk management system." Was not he stopped. "I need to know what you put in there." "What I put in there," Caleb said, "is exactly what I told you I would have. Parallel record, context, documentation of the full scope of the discussions that led to Torthstar's structure. Documentation of Evelyn. Documentation of participants," Caleb said. "All of them. She wasn't a participant." "The documentation," Caleb said, with the specific patience of a man who has rehearsed this moment many times, reflects the full range of individuals present in discussions related to Northstar's financial architecture. The interpretation of that documentation is a matter for attorneys." Evelyn's right hand, flat on the table, pressed down until she could feel the edge of the table against her palm. Mara glanced at her hand and then back at the speaker. "You used her," Adrian said. His voice had gone quiet. "You built a record that puts her name in the middle of something she knew nothing about." "I built a record that accurately reflects." "Stop," the word came out hard. "Stop with the phrasing. I've been listening to phrasing for 2 days and I'm done with it. You built something that was designed to look like Evelyn was involved, so that if this collapsed, the federal exposure would land on her before it landed on you." Pause. "I built a contingency," Caleb said, "that we discussed." The room went completely still. On the legal pad, Mara's hand stopped moving. "We discussed the possibility," Caleb continued, "of documentation that would provide flexibility in how the principal's roles were understood if the structure became subject to scrutiny. You agreed to that framework." Adrian said nothing for 8 full seconds. "I agreed to a framework," he said finally. "I didn't agree to a specific individual." "The framework implied an individual," Caleb said. "The individual who provided the financial architecture for the guarantee packages. The individual whose signature was on the documents. The individual who was in the most natural position to have been involved." A pause. "You knew who that would be, Adrian?" The silence after that was different from the other silences. It had a different weight, not the weight of someone looking for words, but the weight of someone who has just heard something, confirmed that they had arranged, very carefully, not to hear confirmed. Evelyn stood up from the table. She had to. Her body required it. She stood with her back to the speaker, and her hand covering her mouth for exactly 3 seconds, and then she turned around and sat back down because there was no option that involved leaving this room before the call ended. Mara reached across the table and put her hand over Evelyn's. Evelyn did not look at her. She kept her eyes on the speaker. "I need to know," Adrian said on the recording, "what it would take to remove her name from that ledger." A pause. The ledger, Caleb said carefully, is a legal document. Altering it at this stage, what I'm not asking about altering it. I'm asking about context, counter-documentation, whatever it takes to ensure that when those entries are read by a federal investigator, they are read with the full and accurate understanding that Evelyn Marlowe had no involvement in North Star's operations. A long pause. That, Caleb said, would require a conversation that I'm not prepared to have on this phone. Then where? Tomorrow. My attorney's office. 9 in the morning. I'll be there, Adrian. Caleb's voice had shifted slightly. A degree of warmth appeared in it that was more frightening than his precision. Bring your own attorney, not Evelyn's. Yours, the call ended. The recording stopped. Mara and Evelyn sat in the conference room and listened to the silence where the call had been. He knew, Evelyn said. She said it the way you say something you already know when the confirmation arrives, not with surprise, but with the specific exhaustion of having hoped for a different answer. He knew it would be me. He didn't select you, Mara said carefully. Not in the way of sitting down and choosing a name. He agreed to a framework, Evelyn said, and he understood what the framework implied. And he did not say no. She looked at the speaker. That is a selection. Mara withdrew her hand. She was silent for a moment. Then, the recording is enough to establish that the third ledger was created as a contingency mechanism, not as an accurate record of your involvement. It's not everything we need, but it materially changes the context. How quickly can you get it to Ashworth? Tonight. Within the hour. Do it. Evelyn's stood up again, and this time she stayed standing. And I need you to do something else. What? I need you to get me into that board meeting. Mara looked at her. What board meeting? Vanderlyn Capital is going to have an emergency board session within 48 hours. They have no choice. The credit facilities are in question. The lenders are asking for explanations. The institutional investors are going to start demanding answers. The moment the news breaks about the federal investigation, she moved to the window. When that meeting happens, I need to be in the room. Evelyn, not as Adrian's wife, not as a party to the investigation. As the person who has the clearest picture of Vanderlyn Capital's financial history and the only viable restructuring plan that protects the employees. Mara was quiet for a moment. You've been working on a restructuring plan. For 3 weeks. A pause. When did you start? The same night you showed me the 3 Manila folders, Evelyn said. I knew that whatever happened with Adrian and the marriage and the investigation, there were 4,000 people employed by that company who didn't make any of these decisions. And I knew that if the company collapsed because of what Adrian and Victor and Caleb had done, those 4,000 people would pay for it. And that felt, she stopped. She looked at the window. That felt like the wrong ending. Mara looked at her for a long moment. I'll make the calls, she said. The emergency board meeting of Vanderlyn Capital was called for 40 hours later in the 52nd floor conference room of their headquarters building above Midtown Manhattan. 16 board members, 5 of them appearing by video from other time zones. The company's outside counsel, the CFO, Dennis, who had aged visibly in 48 hours and wore the expression of a man who had begun reconsidering his career choices approximately 2 days too late. And Evelyn. She arrived 12 minutes before the scheduled start. Not early in the way she had arrived at the Sunday lunches, not the early of someone managing a performance. The early of someone who needed to have seen the room before the room filled, to have stood in it briefly without other people in it, and felt its specific weight. The room was all glass and altitude. The city was spread below it in all directions, in the clear autumn morning light, which was beautiful and completely irrelevant to anything being discussed in it. She set her files on the table at the chair that had been placed for her. Not at the head, she had not asked for the head, but midway along the left side, positioned so that she could see everyone and everyone could see her, without anyone having to turn an uncomfortable angle. Adrian came in 4 minutes later. He looked at her across the conference room table, and she looked at him, and the look contained everything and required no translation. He had done what she asked. She had done what she said she would do. That exchange was complete. What existed between them now was the specific neutrality of two people who have moved past everything that was personal into the territory of what has to be done. He sat down at his usual place. For perhaps the last time, Evelyn thought, watching him arrange his folders and his water glass and his pen, with the unconscious precision of a man who has sat in a specific chair so many times that his body knows the ritual without instruction. Victor Dane came in behind two of the other board members. He saw Evelyn, and his face went through a rapid and involuntary series of expressions that he then controlled, the way you control a stumble quickly, with the practiced reflex of someone who cannot afford to be seen stumbling. He sat down across the table and did not look at her again, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Margot Vanderlyn was not present. She had no formal board role, had never needed one, in the way that people with informal power rarely need formal titles. Her absence was deliberate, and Evelyn understood from it that Margot had made a calculation. The specific calculation of a woman who had survived by reading rooms correctly for 71 years and had read this one. The board chair, an older man named Gerald Fitch, who had been on the board since before Adrian took over, called the meeting to order at 9:04. He was 80 years old and had the quality of very old, powerful men who had stopped performing and were simply themselves, which made them, paradoxically, more formidable than they had been when they were younger and trying. "We have an unusual situation," he said without preamble. "I think we all know that. I'd like to begin with a full accounting from the CFO, and then we're going to hear from Ms. Marlowe, and then we're going to make decisions." He looked around the table. "Does anyone have an objection to that order?" Victor started to speak. Gerald looked at him. "That wasn't really a question, Victor." Victor closed his mouth. Dennis began. He was competent and thorough and deeply miserable, and he laid out the financial position of Vanderlyn Capital with the precision of a man who understood that accuracy was now his only available protection. Credit facilities, the lender questions, the quarterly review that was now, given the federal investigation, functionally suspended. The specific gap between what the company's disclosed financial position was and what it would be when the guarantee structures that Evelyn had provided were formally removed from the equation. The board members from the video screens asked questions. Some of the questions were good. Some were the questions of people trying to understand whether they had personal exposure. All of them were the questions of people who had believed a mythology and were discovering it had a different structure than they thought. Dennis answered for 42 minutes. Then Gerald looked at Mara, who was seated one chair down from Evelyn. "Miss Ellison." Mara stood. What she did in the next 30 minutes was the most precise thing Evelyn had ever watched her do, and Mara was a precise woman. She laid out 9 years of financial history with the methodical calm of a demolition expert who knows exactly which wall to take down first to make the whole structure visible. She used documents, the real documents, Evelyn's documents, the guarantee packages and the backup agreements and the communications between Evelyn's and the lenders that had, over 9 years, repeatedly placed herself between Vanderlyn Capital and consequences it had earned. She showed the board what the company's position would have been without Evelyn's involvement. She had modeled it. She had a financial consultant who had built the model and whose credentials were unimpeachable, and the model was clear. Without the guarantee packages, Vanderlyn Capital had 3 separate points in its recent history where it would not have survived. Then she showed them North Star. She showed them where the money went. She showed them the handwritten instruction, EM, guarantee proceeds, keep off primary ledger in Adrian's hand, authenticated. She showed them Victor Dane's corporate amendment filed the morning after Evelyn met with federal investigators. She showed them the recording. She played enough of it that the room understood what it contained. Not all of it strategic economy, leaving the board with questions they wanted answered so that when Evelyn spoke, they were already leaning toward her. Then Mara sat down. The room was very quiet. The particular quiet of people who have had something they believed replaced with something true. Gerald looked at Evelyn. She stood up. She had not written a speech. She did not use notes. She had been moving toward this moment for 9 years, in the way that all the things you absorb and carry, and do not say move toward a moment eventually, and when the moment comes, preparation exists in your bones rather than on a piece of paper. I want to be clear about something, she said. I am not here to be believed. I'm here because 4,000 people who work for this company made no decisions about North Star Meridian and deserve no consequences from it. She looked around the table. Everything Mara has shown you today is documented and has been provided to federal investigators. The investigation will proceed regardless of what happens in this room. What happens in this room is about whether Vanderlyn Capital survives as a company that functions under honest governance, or whether it becomes a case study in what happens when a board allows mythology to replace accountability. She looked at Adrian. He looked back at her. His hands were flat on the table, and he was very still. I provided financial support to this company because I believed it employed people who deserved the stability I could help provide, she said. I did not provide that support to fund undisclosed structures. I did not consent to having my name used as a contingency plan. And I did not spend 9 years quietly carrying this company's weight in order to sit in this room and watch the people who built that undisclosed structure be protected from its consequences. She let that sit for a moment. I am not going to let that happen. She opened the folder in front of her and placed a single printed document on the table. This is a restructuring proposal, she said. It is fully modeled and independently reviewed. It preserves the company's core operations. It protects employee positions. It requires independent governance, immediate removal of family influence from financial decisions, full cooperation with the federal investigation, and the removal of Victor Dane from the board, pending the outcome of that investigation. Victor's head came up. Evelyn looked at him directly, for the first time since the meeting started. Victor, she said, with the specific calm of someone who has been angry and has come out the other side into something colder and more useful, you filed a corporate amendment to North Star Meridian's registered agent information on the morning after I met with federal investigators. You were aware of the investigation, and you attempted to restructure the documentation ahead of it. That is not going to be a survivable position, and the fastest way for you to improve your personal exposure is to cooperate fully and immediately, rather than continue the legal strategy your attorneys are currently pursuing. She held his gaze for one more second. That's not a threat. That's an assessment. Victor looked at the table. Then the door opened. Everyone looked up. Sienna Vale stood in the doorway. The room went through a collective response that was physical chairs shifting, postures adjusting, the involuntary realignment of a group of people encountering something they had not anticipated. Evelyn went completely still, not from shock, from the specific alertness of someone who has been in enough rooms to understand that unexpected arrivals are never purely accidental. Persists. Sienna was dressed simply. No performance in it. She was not the woman from the Sunday lunch, the one who had worn a dress that was almost right, who had moved through a room reading status signals. She looked like someone who had made a decision and was living in the 5 seconds after it. She looked at Adrian. I'm sorry, she said. I know I'm not supposed to be here. Gerald started to speak. Sienna looked at him. I'll leave in 2 minutes, she said. I just need 2 minutes. Something in the way she said it. The specific absence of performance in it made Gerald pause. He looked at Evelyn, which was itself significant. Asking Evelyn's permission in a Vanderlyn Capital board meeting. Asking the woman who had just dismantled 9 years of company mythology whether the door should stay open. Evelyn gave the smallest nod. Sienna looked at the room. She had clearly prepared something to say and was now discovering that the room was different from the one she had prepared for. She adjusted quickly, the way someone adjusts when reality doesn't match the rehearsal. Adrian told me, she said, 2 weeks before the lunch. He told me he was going to bring me to the house and introduce me. He told me that Evelyn he said she would handle it. That's the phrase he used. She looked at Adrian. He said she would handle it. And I thought that meant she knew, that there was some kind of understanding. A pause. I didn't know she didn't know. She looked at Evelyn then. Direct. Unflinching in a way that took something from her. I didn't know, she said, what he was doing. What he'd been doing. I found out afterward pieces of it first, then more. And when I understood the full picture, she stopped. Her jaw worked for a moment. He told his attorneys 3 days ago that he was considering a strategy. For the investigation, They were going to try to establish that you had constructive knowledge of North Star. That because you structured the guarantees and communicated with the lenders, you could be made to appear like you understood what the funds were being used for. The room went absolutely silent. Not quiet, silent. The specific silence of a room in which everyone has simultaneously stopped breathing. Evelyn stood at the end of that silence and felt it move through her, not rage, not collapse, but a kind of white clarity. The clarity that comes when the last piece of something you have been assembling arrives and the shape of it is finally complete and whole and visible. He never intended to follow through. Sienna continued quickly. I think I believe that. He said it would only be a last resort. But they discussed it, and she looked at Adrian, and in the look was something complicated. The remains of something that had once been uncomplicated. I'm not going to sit on that. She looked at Evelyn one more time. I'm sorry, she said. For the lunch. For all of it. For the parts I didn't know about, and the parts should have asked more questions about. Then she looked at Gerald. I'm done. I'll go. She left. The door closed. The room stayed silent for another 3 seconds, and then broke open all at once. 3 board members talking, the video screens flickering with voices. Dennis saying something to the outside counsel. Victor Dane staring at the surface of the table, with the expression of a man who has just watched the last viable exit, close. Gerald Fitch put one hand flat on the table. Quiet, he said. He said it once, at ordinary volume, and the room quieted. The authority of 80 years, and not caring anymore what people thought. He looked at Adrian. Did you discuss, he said, a legal strategy that involved positioning Evelyn Marlowe as having constructive knowledge of North Star Meridian? Adrian's throat moved. Evelyn watched him. She watched the moment when he calculated the cost of lying against the cost of the truth, and she watched him reach the conclusion that the calculation had reached for everyone else in this room, one after another. Over the past 72 hours, the truth was no longer the worse option. Yes, he said. Gerald looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the board. I think, he said, we're ready to vote. Evelyn Slend sat back down. She felt the surface of the chair beneath her, solid and present. She felt her own breathing, even and steady, despite everything. She felt, for the first time since she had stood in a ballroom in Connecticut 12 years ago, and decided that Adrian Vanderlyn was a man worth standing beside, the specific and irreplaceable sensation of being completely, unconditionally done. Done with the carrying, done with the absorbing, done with the performance of someone who handled things so that the people around her never had to understand the cost. Gerald called the vote. It moved around the table with the momentum of something that had been decided before the words were spoken, the particular gravity of a room that has seen enough truth in 90 minutes to make the mythology unsustainable. Evelyn's restructuring plan passed 11-2. Victor Dane abstained. Adrian did not vote. Gerald looked at Adrian across the table, and in the look was no cruelty and no warmth, just the flat assessment of an old man who had seen companies built and destroyed, and understood that what survived was rarely what anyone expected. Adrian, he said, the board would like your resignation from executive leadership, effective immediately. Full cooperation with the federal investigation, beginning today. Adrian looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. The room waited. And in that silence, the silence of 16 people, and a history and a company, and 9 years of Sunday lunches and financial guarantees, and all the invisible labor of a woman who had been treated as a resource until the moment. She decided she was done being one Adrian Vanderlyn. Adrian Vanderlyn nodded once. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was not the nod of a man performing contrition for an audience. It was small and deliberate, the nod of someone who has run out of the particular energy required to be anything other than what he is, and what he was, in that moment, was a man who had lost. He picked up the pen in front of him. He signed the resignation document Gerald Fitch's assistants had placed in front of him with the quiet efficiency of someone who had clearly prepared it in advance, which meant Gerald had known how the vote would go before the vote was called, which meant Gerald Fitch was, at 80 years old, still several moves ahead of everyone in the room. The pen went down. Adrian pushed the document toward Gerald without looking at it again. Then he looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him, held it for 2 seconds. Then she moved her eyes to the window and the city beyond it, because there was nothing left in that particular exchange that required her attention, and her attention was a finite resource that she had spent too much of in the wrong directions for too long. Gerald picked up the signed document. He looked at it briefly, then set it to his left. "The board will recess for 15 minutes, he said. "When we reconvene, we'll begin working through the restructuring proposal." Chairs moved, voices started up. The specific, organized chaos of a room full of people who have just witnessed something irreversible and are now individually processing what it means for them, personally. Evelyn stayed in her chair. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the restructuring proposal still open on the table. In front of her, her handwriting in the margins, her calculations, the 3 weeks of nighttime work that had gone into it while she was simultaneously managing attorneys and federal contacts and Rachel Soren and Malcolm, and the slow, controlled demolition of a life she'd spent 9 years constructing. Mara sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. 11-2, Mara said quietly. "I heard. The 2 who voted against are the ones with direct personal relationships to Victor. They'll come around when they understand their own exposure." "I know." A pause, Evelyn. Mara's voice was the one underneath the attorney voice. "It's done." Evelyn looked at the window. The city was doing what the city always did. It did not mark the moment. It would not mark it. 12 years from now, the corner of this building and this street and this altitude above Manhattan would look exactly as it looked right now, and no one passing below would know that anything had happened here. She found that comforting. "It's not done," she said. "It's done in this room. The federal investigation has 18 months minimum. The restructuring will take 2 years to fully implement. The divorce proceedings, you know what I mean." She did know. She sat with it for a moment, the specific knowledge of what Mara meant, the part that was done, the part that had been the hardest and most essential part that required her to stop being the person she had been and become someone she was still, in some ways, discovering. "Yes," she said finally. "I know what you mean." Victor Dane's attorney called Mara's office before the board reconvened. Full cooperation. Immediate. Whatever terms the federal investigation required. Mara took the call outside the conference room and came back with the expression she wore when something had happened that she had predicted and found no satisfaction in. "He folded," she told Evelyn simply. "He was always going to fold," Evelyn said. "He just needed to see the vote. His cooperation will accelerate Ashworth's timeline significantly." "Good. It also means the documentation on North Star becomes clearer faster, which means the question of your name in the third ledger gets resolved." "I know," Evelyn said. "Let it move." Mara looked at her. "You're not worried anymore." "I'm worried," Evelyn said. "I'm just done letting the worry run the decisions." When the board reconvened, Evelyn walked them through the restructuring proposal with the same flat-voiced precision she had used in lender meetings for 9 years, except this time there was no one else's company she was protecting. This time the precision was in service of something she had built herself, in the night hours of a furnished apartment on the Upper West Side, and it showed not in how she presented it, but in how she answered questions. The specific quality of knowledge that comes from having built something rather than simply analyzed it. The outside counsel asked about the timeline for independent governance implementation. She answered. A board member on video from London asked about the employee pension positions. She answered. Dennis, who had been sitting at the far end of the table, with the expression of a man watching his professional life rearrange itself in real time, asked 3 technical questions about the credit facility restructuring, and she answered all 3 in sequence, from memory, without looking at the document. He wrote something down. Then he looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating. You've had this prepared for 3 weeks, he said. It was not quite a question. Yes. While all of this was, he gestured vaguely at the room, at the day, at the entire preceding 96 hours. Yes, she said. He nodded slowly. He looked like he wanted to say something else and then decided it wasn't the right room for it. The meeting ended at 12:41 in the afternoon. 3 hours and 37 minutes after it began. Gerald Fitch shook Evelyn's hand at the door and held it for a moment longer than a handshake required. The specific pressure of an old man acknowledging something he couldn't quite put into professional language. "Young woman," he said, "I've been on 16 corporate boards in 50 years. He paused. "I have never seen anyone do what you just did in that room." "What did I do?" she asked, not modestly. She genuinely wanted to hear how it looked from outside. He thought about it. "You protected people who had no idea they needed protecting," he said, "without making it about yourself." Another pause. "That's rarer than it should be." He released her hand and walked to the elevator. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the conference room for a moment longer. The room was emptying behind her. Assistants gathering documents, board members in quiet conversations, Dennis on his phone in the corner, already working. The machinery of a company reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity. Adrian was the last to leave. He came past her in the doorway, and he stopped. They stood for a moment in the threshold, neither inside the room nor out of it, the particular geography of a marriage that no longer existed and a history that did. "The record," he said. "The corporate history. I meant what I said. I want it formally documented." She looked at him. "Your attorney can coordinate with Mara." "I know." He paused. "I'm saying I want it, not because it helps me legally. It doesn't. I want it because he stopped. Started again. Because the record should tell the truth. And the truth is that you kept this company alive. Not me." She looked at him for a long moment. At his face, which she had known for 12 years, and which looked, right now, like the face he might have had if he had made different choices, tireder, smaller, more honest. "I'll have Mara handle it," she said. He nodded. He started to move past her. "Adrian." Her own voice surprised her slightly, not its tone, which was even, but its content, because she had not planned to say anything else. "Part of you that built this company, the part that was genuinely good at it." She paused. "That was real. I want you to know I know that." He looked at her. And in his eyes, those eyes she had looked into 12 years ago in a ballroom in Connecticut and decided were worth trusting, was something she recognized as genuine, which was grief. Not performed grief, the real version. "It wasn't enough," he said. "No," she said, "it wasn't." He walked to the elevator. She watched him go. Then she picked up her bag and her files and walked in the other direction, toward the stairs, because she had always preferred stairs, and because the specific physical act of going down under her own power felt, today, like something she needed. The months that followed had a quality she hadn't anticipated. She had expected relief. She had expected, perhaps, some version of triumph muted private, the satisfaction of a thing completed. What she had not expected was the specific texture of the time, which was not smooth or clean but irregular, the way healing is irregular, the way any large structural change is irregular, because the structure doesn't know it's supposed to be finished, it just keeps moving. The federal investigation moved with the methodical pace of federal investigations, which was to say, slowly enough to be maddening and thoroughly enough to be, ultimately, definitive. Victor Dane's cooperation, as Mara had predicted, accelerated the timeline significantly. His testimony connected North Star Meridian's financial flows to three separate development deals, and two city officials who had received payments structured as consulting fees through holding companies with no real consulting function. It was not complicated corruption, it was the ordinary kind. The kind that happens when people with access to money decide that money is a more reliable tool than ethics, and surround themselves with enough legal structure that the ethics question never has to be directly confronted. Caleb Sorsine was indicted on 6 counts. He was the most prepared of all of them for this outcome, and also, paradoxically, the least equipped to handle it. The man who had spent 15 years engineering, the position of being the one whose name never ended up on the wrong line, discovered that his primary skill had been, in the end, a kind of elaborate self-deception. He had believed himself to be invisible because he was behind the paper. He had not understood that the paper remembered everything. The third ledger's fabricated entries regarding Evelyn were addressed systematically. The recording of Adrian's call provided the framework. Claire Ashworth's team found 3 dates in the ledger where Caleb had placed Evelyn's presence at meetings. She provably had not attended. 1 date she had been in London. 1 date she had been in a hospital waiting room with Mara's mother, who had broken her hip, and 1 date she had been on the phone with her own financial advisor for 3 consecutive hours, a call with a documented record on both ends. Those 3 anchors were enough to establish the ledger's 3rd section as constructed rather than recorded. The entries involving Evelyn were formally excluded from the federal evidentiary record. She was cleared. Mara called her with the news at 7:40 in the morning on a Thursday in February, 4 months after the board meeting. Evelyn was at her kitchen counter with coffee. She listened to Mara say the words formally excluded, no further inquiry into your role. The record reflects. And she said, "Thank you," and ended the call and sat for a while looking at the photograph of her mother. The ceramic mug from Venice was in her hands. She held it and sat and let the morning be quiet. Malcolm came for dinner in March. He came alone, which was right. He brought wine, which was awkward in the way that gestures of apology always carry a residue of awkwardness, because a bottle of wine is a small thing to carry into a room where you left someone unprotected for 2 years. She let him bring it anyway. She opened it and poured 2 glasses, and they sat at her kitchen table. And he told her about his testimony, which had been complete, and about his new attorney, who had been good, and about the particular experience of going from being a Vanderlyn to being someone who had testified against one, which had rearranged his sense of himself in ways he was still sorting through. "Margot won't speak to me," he said. "That won't last. You know her better than I do. Margot does what protects Margot," Evelyn said, not unkindly. "When she calculates that having you estranged costs her more than having you present, she'll call." Malcolm turned the wine glass in his hands. "How are you?" he asked. Not the social version, the real version. She thought about it, honestly. "Some days are straightforward," she said. "Some days are harder than I expected. The hard part isn't what I thought it would be. I thought the hard part would be the investigation, the divorce, the legal machinery. Those were manageable." She looked at the table. "The hard part is smaller than that. The muscle memory, 9 years of specific habits, knowing what he took his coffee with, having opinions about things I only developed opinions about because they mattered in his world." She paused. "Realizing you've organized a portion of yourself around another person, and now that portion has to find something else to do." Malcolm was quiet for a moment. "Are you finding it? Something else for it to do?" She thought about the Marlowe initiative, which had been incorporated 2 months earlier. The first round of applications was already running. She had reviewed 47 of them personally, staying up past midnight 3 nights in a row with a yellow legal pad and her own shortlist criteria she had written herself without consulting anyone. The first professional framework she had built entirely from her own judgment rather than in service of someone else's. "Yes," she said, "I am." The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in April. Her attorney's office, Mara across the table, Adrian's attorney beside him. Adrian himself, who looked like a man who had been living with consequence for 6 months and had discovered that consequence, unlike power, does not accommodate performance. He was thinner. The particular expensive ease that had always been his most visible quality was gone, replaced by something more ordinary and, she thought, more real. They signed in sequence, standard documents. The settlement had been negotiated over 10 weeks with minimal conflict, which surprised people who expected more from a Vanderlyn divorce. What those people didn't understand was that Adrian's most genuine quality, the one that had made her fall for him in the first place, the one that had survived the acquisition and the debt and the mistress and the North Star structure and the contingency plan and the board meeting, was his ability, when truly stripped of everything, to recognize a fair thing. The settlement was fair. He had made sure of it. There was one unusual clause, and it was his. She read it again as she signed, even though she had read it 7 times before. Formal recognition in Vanderlyn Capital's permanent corporate history of Evelyn Marlowe's financial contributions to the company's survival. Not a settlement clause for optics, a real clause, legally binding, written into the governance documents, with the same permanence as the company's founding charter. The record telling the truth. She signed the page. Signed the page. The attorney notarized. And that was the end of that. In the elevator going down, Mara said nothing, which was correct. What had happened upstairs required nothing added to it. They rode down together in silence, and when they reached the lobby, Mara turned to her. "Lunch?" she asked. "Yes," Evelyn said. "Somewhere with a good window." The Marlowe Initiative held its first public event in May, in a mid-sized event space in Lower Manhattan that was not flashy and not modest, simply appropriate. Chosen because it had good acoustics and enough natural light that the room felt, as Evelyn had wanted it to feel, like a place where serious work was taken seriously. 43 women were there. Founders, principals, operators, women who ran companies that traditional financing structures had looked at and found reasons to pass on. The reasons were various and consistent, and to anyone paying genuine attention, largely reducible to a single underlying cause that the industry had agreed not to name too directly. Evelyn had named it in the initiative's founding documents. Simply, without ceremony, in the first paragraph, she stood at the front of the room and looked at the 43 faces looking back at her. She had prepared remarks. She used about half of them, because the other half were the version she had written for a version of herself that was still managing an impression, and she had stopped managing impressions 6 months ago, and so she spoke the other half instead. She told them about the first guarantee she had provided to Vanderlyn Capital, how she had stayed up through the night on the numbers, alone, because Adrian had been asleep and she hadn't woken him, because she hadn't wanted him to see the degree of difficulty the situation presented, had wanted to give him the solution rather than the problem. She told them she had made that choice continuously, across 9 years, across 3 financial crises, across a marriage that had needed the appearance of his strength more than it had needed the reality of her contribution. She told them she was not making that choice anymore. "What I'm building," she said, "is not a charity. It's not a gesture. It's not my story being turned into a brand." She looked at the room. "It's a financial structure with capital behind it and genuine investment terms, and the specific belief that the reason traditional financing has passed on your companies is not the reason it told you." She paused. "The work I'm doing here is the same work I've always done. The difference is that this time, the name on the building is mine." The room was quiet for a moment. Then a woman in the third row started clapping, and the room followed, and Evelyn stood in it and let it be what it was, which was not vindication and not triumph, but something more durable than both, the recognition, by people who understood the specific cost of being overlooked, of someone who had stopped being overlooked. She did not cry. She had cried twice in the preceding 6 months. Once in the stairwell of the Vanderlyn Capital building, on the day of the board meeting 3 floors below the conference room, alone for 4 minutes before she straightened up and walked the rest of the way down. Once in her apartment in January, very late, over nothing specific, just the accumulated weight of everything specific, arriving all at once in a quiet moment, the way those things do. Both times she had let it happen, and then she had stopped and moved forward. This was not a crying moment. This was a working moment. The first of many. In June, Claire Ashworth called personally to tell her that the federal case against Caleb Soren had been formally indicted, and that the documentation regarding Evelyn's role had been entered into the official record as exculpatory. The word exculpatory had a specific taste that Evelyn held in her mouth for a moment after the call, the taste of something that should have been unnecessary, of a word that should never have been required, of the specific injustice, of having to prove a negative about yourself to authorities who would not have been investigating your negative at all if someone hadn't spent 3 years manufacturing evidence of it. She thanked Ashworth. Then she called Mara. "It's over," she said. "The federal piece, yes," Mara said. "The restructuring will." "Mara," she said it gently. "I know what's still ongoing. I'm saying the part that was done is done." A pause. Then Mara said, "Yes, that part is done." "Okay." She looked out the window of her office, in the building she had leased for the Marlowe Initiative, with her name on the directory in the lobby. "Then let's get back to work." On a Thursday evening in late June, the Vanderlyn Capital Recovery Gathering happened in a ballroom in Midtown. Evelyn had been invited and had almost declined, and then had not declined because understood, when she thought about it with honesty, that the reason she wanted to decline was not the right reason. It wasn't dignity. It was the old instinct to stay quiet, stay invisible, let the room belong to someone else's instinct. And she was done with that instinct. She went alone. No Mara, no attorney, no protective layer of professional context. Just herself, in a dress she had bought last week, in a room full of people who had worked for a company she had helped keep alive. The new CCO, a woman named Sandra Chung, who had been brought in by the reconstituted board. A former CFO of a larger fund who had spent 20 years being excellent and overlooked in a way that had clearly refined rather than defeated her, gave a speech about the company's recovery. It was precise and honest in the way speeches from people who actually understand what they're talking about are honest, which is to say it did not gloss over what had happened and did not manufacture more optimism than the facts supported. Then Sandra said something that Evelyn had not known was coming. She told them about the guarantees. She didn't use corporate language. She used the plain version. She told them that on 3 separate occasions, in the company's recent history, when the company had come closest to insolvency, when the people in this room had been closest to losing their jobs, their pensions, their professional futures, there had been a person who quietly stepped in and covered the gap, who had placed her own financial position between the company and collapse, who had done this not as an investor, not as a board member, not in any formal capacity that would have given her recognition or return, but as a private individual who had believed that the work the company did was worth protecting. Her name, Sandra said, is Evelyn Marlowe, and she is here tonight. The room found her. It happened the way these moments happen, a few heads turning, the information moving outward in a wave, and then the sound building, and then Evelyn was standing near the back of a ballroom, full of people who were on their feet, and the sound was enormous, and she was completely unprepared for it, which was the most honest thing about the moment. She spent 9 years being the person who made the room work without the room knowing. She was not prepared for the room knowing. She stood in it and felt it move through her, not pride, not relief, something more complicated than both, something that had the specific texture of debt being acknowledged, of labor made visible, of the particular experience of being seen by the people whose reality you had actually affected, not by the people who controlled the narrative. She did not raise her hand in acknowledgement. She did not make a speech. She simply stood in the back of the room and let it be what it was, loud and imprecise and human and real, until it settled. Then Sandra moved on, and the evening continued, and Evelyn found herself in conversations she had not anticipated. People who worked in operations and compliance and mid-level management, people who would never have been in the same room as a Vanderlyn spouse in any previous version of her life, people who wanted to shake her hand or simply say, "Thank you." And she took each one seriously, because each one was serious. Each one represented a mortgage or a child's school or a particular financial stability that had continued without interruption, partly because of what she had done, and partly because of what she had chosen to do when she could have simply protected herself and walked away. She had not walked away. That was the part she had not fully understood about herself until tonight. Even at the end, even with the guarantees suspended and the evidence delivered and the divorce filed, she had built the restructuring plan. She had come to the board meeting not to watch the company collapse, but to give it a path that didn't require its employees to pay for its leadership's corruption. She had not walked away from the people who deserved protecting. She had only walked away from the ones who didn't. Later, much later, after the event had emptied and she had said her last goodbye and walked through the lobby and out onto the street, she stood on the sidewalk in the warm June evening and felt the city around her in the specific way you feel a city, when you are neither arriving nor departing, but simply present in it. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A message from the founder of the first company, the Marlowe Initiative, had backed a woman named Grace, who built industrial-scale water filtration systems for agricultural use and had been told by 11 separate investment groups that the market wasn't ready, which was the thing investment groups said when they didn't understand a market. The message said, "We just signed our largest contract. 14 municipalities. I wanted you to know tonight." Evelyn read it twice. Then she typed back, "Tell me everything tomorrow." She put the phone in her bag and stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer. She thought about the Sunday lunches, the way she had arrived early and managed every invisible detail and sat in the right chair and performed the right version of a woman who belonged in that room. The weight of 9 years of that particular labor, the labor of being useful in ways that were never acknowledged, of carrying things that were never named, of keeping a structure intact that was, beneath its polish, fundamentally dishonest. She had carried all of it, and then she had put it down. Not because someone gave her permission, not because the circumstances finally forced her hand. She had put it down because she had walked to the edge of the thing she had been carrying and looked at it, clearly, finally, without the insulation of hope or habit or the particular comfort of being necessary. And she had understood that the weight did not belong to her. It had never belonged to her. She had simply picked it up because no one else was going to. She started walking. Manhattan moved around her, the way it always moved, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, in the 10,000 simultaneous directions of a city that contained everything and required nothing. She had always loved that about it, the way it did not need her to be anything, the way it existed in its own enormous indifference, and you could move through that indifference, either lost in it or free in it, depending on what you brought to the movement. She brought herself. Just herself, the name on her own building, the work she had chosen, the decision she had made in the preceding 9 months, with no one's interests, ahead of her own for the first time in longer than she could precisely calculate. Evelyn Marlowe. Not Evelyn Vanderlyn. Not Adrian's wife. Not the woman who had quietly saved the empire and not been credited for it, or the woman whose name had been written into someone else's contingency plan, or the woman at the end of the table who absorbed everything and performed composure. Just Evelyn, who had built something once and given it away and built something again and kept it, who had loved someone imperfectly and been used for it and survived, who had stood in a federal conference room and in a board meeting and in her own kitchen and made the decisions that needed making without waiting for someone to tell her they were correct, who was walking through Manhattan on a June evening with a text message in her bag about 14 municipalities and a company she had believed in before anyone else had, and who felt, for the first time in longer than she could name, that the weight on her shoulders was exactly the weight she had chosen. And it was light, not because it was small, because it was hers. She kept walking. The city kept moving. And somewhere behind her, in a document filed with the State Corporate Commission and entered into the permanent historical record of a company called Vanderlyn Capital, her name was written down in the right context, for the right reasons, in a way that no one could restructure or exclude or redirect. The record finally told the truth. She had made sure of that. And now she was done making sure of things for other people. Now she had work to do.